Hello everyone and welcome to Rebel Way. My name's Andrew Sutherland and today we're going to be recreating this Star Wars scene that you see here. And this is comprised of a few effects just all layered up. As you can see here, we're going to take a look at... So here we can see we've got some rigid body destruction, very simple little RBD sim. We've got this pop sim of these laser trails. We've got some sparks. We've got this little explosion for the impact of the laser trails, and then we've got this fire that breaks out. And then lastly we have our main explosion. And if we layer all those things up together, we should hopefully get something like this. So in Houdini, we can do things a number of ways, and we have a number of different contexts. So before we jump into this final project, I'm just going to go over some beginner concepts within Houdini. So we have this object level, which is where most of our work is going to take place. And what we'd like to do starting off is drop down a geometry node, and we can dive inside, and we're in this geometry context, which we often refer to as SOPs. And that's just because we have access to all these types of nodes, and for the most part we call these SOP nodes, and the S in SOP stands for surface. So we're dealing with everything that has for surface and points, but we simplify things by just calling them surface operators. When we dive into simulation, we tend to put down what is called a DOP network. So here we have DOPs, and we can dive inside, and here we could put down a number of different solvers. So if we come over to solvers here, we can see we have bullet, we have cloth, we have flip, which is fluid simulations, we have pyro, we have RBD, we have vellum, and these are all DOP solvers. So just to be quick and simple, I'm going to make a quick pop simulation. And the first thing we need is our pop solver. We need a pop object, and we need a pop source. And as you can see, this is where our sourcing comes in. This is our object, and then this is our out. And a lot of the time we also like to add a gravity. We don't have to, but in this case, let's just do a gravity. So this is our usual sort of DOP network. If we were creating a pyro simulation, we would put down a pyro solver, a volume source, and a pyro and a smoke object. And of course, we could put a gravity. And for most of our DOP networks, we're going to see a similar pattern here. We're going to need an object, a source, and a solver. And then, of course, this is basically just applying a downward force, as you can see here. And we could also add a whole bunch of different things. So in the case of Pyro, we have what we call micro solvers. So we could merge in, let's say, some turbulence, gas turbulence, gas disturbance. And what these nodes are going to do is this is going to update our velocities, and it's going to add detail to our simulations. On our pop object, we could, for instance, put down a pop drag. And this is going to do something similar. So here we've got some air resistance, and we're basically modifying our simulation with these nodes. But these are sort of extra things to add detail, add control to our DOP simulations, and they're not necessarily necessary. Our necessary nodes are basically just these three: the object, the solver, and the source. And right now we haven't prepared anything to come into this, so nothing's going to happen here. So let's just delete all of this, and we press play. Obviously we're not going to get anything because we have no data coming in here. So all we need to do is we need to prepare, because this is a pop network, we need to prepare some points for simulation. So we could put down a Pyro burst node. And as you can see here, we have this burst of particles. Now this node is really a whole bunch of nodes wrapped up to be more convenient for us. So if we were to allow editing of contents, and we dive inside, you can see we have a very big network of all sorts of things here that is going to make our lives easier. Because if we want to create something like this, where we've got all these particles and control over all these particles, we're going to need to expose a whole bunch of parameters. So here you can see the number of spikes, the number of points, the length of our trails, the thickness. So all of this control is coming from within this network. Houdini has just made this convenient for us by wrapping it up into a little solver. So what we can do now is plug this into our first input, and on our source node, come over here and say use first context geometry. That way we're pulling in the data from this first input. We're going to say all points. And now you can see we have our first simulation. And it's inheriting the velocity and the shape that we initially set up here in our pop source. So let's add some gravity to this. Let's also set up some collisions. So let's enable our box. Pressing F on our keyboard, we can frame it up. And let's just increase the size here and lower the size on here. And let's prepare this for our collision. So let's put down a VDB from polygons. And we're lowering this resolution because we need to actually capture this. So be careful with this value. We want to aim for something pretty low to medium res. This is pretty high res. We can maybe make this 5. Something like that is cool. Maybe 4. And let's put down a null. So this is going to be col SDF. And this is going to be col geo. If we copy this, we can dive inside. We can put down a merge. And we can put down what's called a static object, and this is going to be responsible for our collisions. We want this to come in first, so we can just move this up here. And under collisions, I'm going to set this to use volume collisions. This is just, I find, more accurate. So we can come over here and say volume sample, because we want to sample that SDF that we just provided. So we're going to go here, and on our subpath, we're going to enter in our geo, something like that. And if we want to visualize our collisions, we can tick this on here, and you can see this has gone a bit blue. So we have our collisions coming in here. So as you can see now, we have this colliding with our particles. But we've had to create this little dot network, and granted this is extremely simple now. We could add some pop drag to give this some air resistance. We could, let's just increase our box. And you can see we're getting this nice simulation. You can see a little bit of bouncing once this hits. So we can come over to our pop object and under physical, and we can say bounce 0. And now we have a stable simulation. But like I said, you know, this is a very simple setup, so this works great for us, and this is very optimized. But in order to make things a little bit beginner friendly and a little bit user friendly, just like we have this very complicated node, but with all kinds of controls to make our lives easier, we could also just put down what's called they're basically little dot networks wrapped up at SOPs. And so we could put down a pop network. And as you can see, this is actually a dot network, but it's already built for us. So this is going to make life easier. Plug this in. We need to just make sure that we're reading in our first context geometry, and we bring in all points. We could add our pop drag. And our gravity, as well as our static object. Okay, so in this case, this pop network is super simple. But what about something like Pyro? So using our same source, we can just put down a Pyro solver. And this is all at the SOP level. And we can plug this in. If we dive inside, you can see this is a much more complicated network, but it's all wrapped up, and we have all kinds of settings to play with here. So in this case, because this is Pyro, we can't just simply give it points. We need to actually convert these points into volumes, because the Pyro solver wants volumes to work with. So under quick setups, we can just click on Pyro simulation. And this is actually going to give us this little network already ready. I'm just going to delete that for now. And let's just take a look at what it's done. So we still have our spikes. And if we come over to burst components, we can see that we've got these 3 attributes created. We've got density, we've got temperature, and we've got burn. And then what we do, and these are still points, so what we need to do is we need to convert these into volumes. So we can just use a rasterize attributes node, and this is going to convert our density, temperature, burn, and velocity into a volume. And once we pass this over to our DOP network, you can see we've got our first pyrosim, and all the hard work was done for us by side effects. So let's come over here to sourcing, and as you can see, this is pretty low. So let's increase our density to something pretty high just for this example's sake. Now we're getting a bit more density in here. I think let's increase this even higher. Our temperature is going to result in this going up because we've got buoyancy. So if we were to turn this temperature off, you can see it's not as buoyant as it was before. Let's also turn off this burn. Let's Let's increase this again. You see how that rises, that's based off the temperature. Our velocity is also being injected in here. Let's turn this off so we can take a look. So this just expands and then the temperature takes over and that's where we get that rise. But we want some punch. And that's coming from our velocities. So let's take a look at shaping this a bit. So we want to add some disturbance, which is going to give us fine detail. And let's expose our settings. So let's increase this to something like 10 for now. And now you can see we're getting some detail in there. I think we maybe make our block size smaller. So lower this to 1. Let's even make this 40. And now you can really see we've got a lot of detail in there. It looks a little bit low res. Let's just check how. Yeah, so we can increase this. Let's maybe lower this to 0.5. And now we can see we've got a lot of disturbance, so let's dial that back down. Cool, so value of 10 is looking pretty good. But what I might want to do is actually put a keyframe here and increase this. So initially as it expands, we've got a value of 20. And then we'll animate that down. Cool, something like that. We could also introduce some turbulence. I think of this as an overall breakup. Let's just try it at this value. We're going to need to increase this. Let's expose our settings. Cool. And let's do what we did before. Let's start off at 10. And then after 1 second, let's reduce this by half. Cool. So what I often like to do is I just wedge these things out and experiment with my simulation. So the point of me of going over this is basically how to work with these wrapped up nodes, and to understand that really all they are is DOP networks that are wrapped up. As you can see here, in the pop simulation, it was very obvious because there's nothing crazy. But in the Pyro simulation, when we say allow editing of context and we dive inside, you can see this is a very complicated network. And really, the reason it's so complicated is because it's exposing so many of these controls out here. So you can just go through these and see how all of this is working, and if you want to investigate them further, you can dive inside and find where that's coming from. So we don't have to dive into these networks and tweak everything. You know, for the complicated nodes like this pop solver, all of this is exposed nicely for us here. So next up, we can plug in a Pyro post-process node. We can convert to 16-bit float, convert to VDB, and then Pyro bake. Let's Pyro bake up here first. And as you can see here, this is going to combine our volumes. If we've got this combined volumes, you can see here we have, if we take a look here, we see our velocity is all separate. So let's combine these volumes. But you can see that this velocity is pretty high res, or you can see all our volumes are pretty low res, but our velocity seems to be the biggest, despite it being invisible. So we don't actually need this to be as high res as that. So what we can do is we can say resample velocity and multiply it by 2. So now it should be half. And I think we can afford to increase our resolution here. So we can come over here and maybe set this to, let's go 3. And let's run our sim again. So this is by no means the best explosion you've ever seen, but I just wanted to show you how quickly that we can get a decent result from these solvers that SideFX has wrapped up for us to give us a whole bunch of control without us spending all our time creating these complicated DOP networks from scratch. So this is just designed to get you started in Houdini, to get some really good looking simulations very, very quickly. And if you want to dive more into understanding what's going under the hood, of course you can dive inside, and I urge you all to start building these from scratch, doing some customization, because you really are going to learn a lot from that. But in this tutorial, I really want to focus on the idea of layering up different effects. And I often find that layering up effects is the thing that's going to sell the scale of our effects. And you can see how just layering up a simple explosion, simple sparks, simple RBD, and we stand back from that and look at the shot as a whole, and it's going to appear like it has a lot of complexity. So that's what we're focusing on in this tutorial. And without further ado, let's jump into the overall project and take a look at how Max created the scene. Thanks for listening. See you in the main project. So this project was set up by Max, an effects artist, and the one thing that he used in this project is this QLib library. So I installed this QLib library, and the way that I installed it is I just downloaded this latest version. I placed that on my documents folder, and then I edited my Houdini environment file. So let me just show you what that looks like. So in my Houdini 20 folder, you can see this houdini.env file, and if I open this with a notepad, you can see I've added this path here, Q library, and then the path, and then I have this. So this is just going to load those OTLs and those nodes into my project. So diving into Houdini, you can see, if I now come over here, you should see we have a whole bunch of these extra nodes that this project needs. Cool. So first things first is that we're just bringing in our geometry, and I will share a proxy version of this, or provide a link of where you can get an X-wing like this. And as you can see, some of these pieces are navy or blue. And so I'm just grouping them, grouping that, and then reversing those faces, and then recomputing the normals. So now our X-wing looks like how it should. We're putting a null out so we can read this out. And for the most part, this is not quite in the center, but we're going to simulate this at the center of our origin, of our scene. And so with that prepared, let's just dive into our main simulation network. So we have some background things like our terrain, wind and lightning, but I think for now we're going to focus on the main explosions and sparks that I showed at the beginning of this tutorial. So if we dive over here, we can see we're reading in that X-wing. And this is positioned into place. Pressing F on my keyboard, I can just find out where it is in my scene exactly. So here it's transformed at the origin of our scene. And we're just blasting away our wings. So on this side, we have this wing. And we're going to peak it. Just going to time shift this so we don't have any animations. Just going to stay on this frame. And here we're going to use this Pyro spread node. So what this is going to do is this is going to cover this in points. So this is going to cover this in points, a bit like a scatter node. But the difference between just a simple scatter is that this can create an attribute called temperature. So in this case, we're creating a temperature attribute on these particles, and we're giving it a value of 0. So if we were to take a look with this color node and we investigate the temperature, and what I like to do is I set something blue for the 0 values and something of red at the 1 values, so kind of like cold to hot. And here you can see that the temperature on all these points is 0. If we were to change this to 1, we now have, we're seeing that everything has temperature. But what we want to do is just initialize this attribute. It's kind of like a placeholder, and we, on the placeholder temperature, it's a value of 0. So what we can do next is we can group some of these points based on this intersection. And so to create this intersection, we've got the sphere, and we're going to noise that up. And then we're going to group this, and we're going to call this hot. We could call this start. We could call it whatever we want. And what we're going to do next is we can say on that group, hot or start or whatever it's called. In this case, it's called hot. We're going to give it a temperature of 1. So if we were to investigate the color here, if we were to visualize the temperature, we can see that our temperature is blue everywhere, and here we're giving it an initial temperature starting point of 1 here. So from there, we can feed this into a growth solver. And in the old days, you would have to sort of make your own sort of growth solver, but Houdini has now given us these nice tools that we can just use, and this one's called Pyro source spread. If we wanted to investigate how this was actually done, it's going to be quite a bit of a complicated network, because it's giving us all these different controls, all the controls that we're really going to need for a growth solver for the most part. So if we dive, so if we come back here and we right click and we say dive into network, and we can come and look here, you can see that we've got this network and we've got a solver here. And so you can investigate how this tool was created if you want.
But for the most part, we're just going to take a look at the settings on the outside and see how this was created. So first things first, let's just cache this to disk. So we've got this cached disk, and you can see that this is our temperature is now spreading along this wing, and we've got some noisy breakups, and that's all coming from this tool here. So this is going to create some spreading along our wing, starting on those infected points, by calling this infection, because I used to often call this like an infectious system. So these ones are infected and they spread. And not only do we want to spread, but we want to give them some variation. And we can do that by adding this noise. And you can, play with your different noise types. And this search radius is going to be the amount of the spread. So you can play with these values and see how you can control the growth of this fire. So from there we can just blast everything that has a low temperature value, or anything below temperature of 0.8. So this is just going to leave us with the hot points, and we can then pass this over to a particle simulation. You can see this is starting on frame 1260. That's just based on our animation. And diving inside, I'm just going to turn our brain off so we can go through this quickly. You can see we've got a simple pop sim. So when creating pop simulations, or most simulations in Houdini, the bare minimum you're going to need a source. You're going to need an object and a solver. So in this case, we've got this pop source, which is going to read our first context geometry. So all these points are coming into here. And our birth rate, these are our settings, and we're adding a little bit of velocity, not really doing much, but we're adding to this velocity. But the main thing that's going to be driving the velocity of these particles is this pop wind. So if we take a look here, you can see we've got adding this wind force in 25. So quite a lot of wind is going to push these particles along this direction. And we're also just breaking that wind up with some turbulence. So you can see here, and these are our settings. This pop force isn't really doing much. I disabled it and ran it, and yeah, it's just a bit more variation, but it basically looks the same without it. You can experiment with these pop forces, pop winds, and just art direct your simulations. And our pop object. So this is just setting up how these particles are going to behave once they hit collisions and stuff like that. We need this. We're not really too concerned with anything crazy, so I think these are all our defaults, but we do want some collisions. And so for that, we're going to come over here, set to collisions, and we're going to set it to volume, so we can use an SDF field and our geometry. So if we're visualizing our we've got a bit of viewport back here. Let's see. Okay, so here we're visualizing our collisions by just taking a look here. So you can see that is just a visualization, and we're preparing our collisions by coming over here, and you can see we're blasting everything but this wing. We're creating a surface field, and we're also adding velocity. And on here we've got the geometry. All we really need is this surface and the geometry. So from there we can feed that in here. So this takes our geo, and this takes that surface, that SDF field from the VDB from polygons. And that's going to give us some nice collisions. So cache that out to disk. And just to visualize, I put down this particle fluid surface. and I've just come over and set this to particles, and I'm visualizing the velocity. So here we can see our particles. Cool. So from there, we're going to pass these particles over to a Pyro simulation so we can set these on fire. And before we do that, we're going to put down a box which is going to encompass where we want our smoke simulation to take. And instead of creating the surface like we did for our collisions, we're going to set to density. And this is just going to fill this box up with its values, a density value. From there, we can scatter on that density, so filling this up with points. And we've got one of those QLib nodes, and this is going to add some velocity in this direction. We can change this direction by changing this. But in this case, we just want the velocity to travel this way. And we're also going to use this point velocity to add some curl noise. So if we were to just visualize that, you can see this is giving us some randomization, and this is setting the direction. So this is just variation, and this is direction. But together, we now have a mostly directional velocity with a little bit of randomization, a little bit of randomness. We always want to add some randomization to make things feel more natural. So here we can visualize this again. We can take a look at this. So we're just sampling velocity, scattering points, and just taking a look at that. But it's kind of the same thing that we've got here. From here we can put down a process, and we can just create VDBs and compute min and max. This is just going to make this more optimized, and we're going to read this velocity field into our smoke simulation, so our smoke gets advected by this velocity. Sort of this velocity is going to push our smoke in this backwards direction, in the direction that was set up by this. So now we just have a volume version, because for Pyro we need a volume version. So creating a volume version for our source points. So here we have our source points from our pop sim, and we're going to use this node to create a temperature. So if we were to just investigate here, come over to color, and let's look at the temperature. You can see without this, they have no temperature. So now we're creating a temperature, and we're using this fall off here you can see it sort of dissipates a bit. So you can control that. So it's going to be like hotter here and more cooler on the smoky side. Just a little bit of extra control. And from here, we want to noise this up. So we can add another one of these. And as you can see, we've got this noise hit to subtract, min and max. So the values are between 0 and 0.88. And we can change these noise types. You can experiment with these, the element size. You get the idea. And it's also animated. So as we travel through this, that noise is going to move. Without this, it's going to be static. It seems like it's moving, but it's just, it's just actually the particles moving. So we want the noise to move too. And now you can really see that noise is moving throughout our sim. Cool. The next thing is we want to do like a different version of this. So for that, we can do the same thing, but this time we can call that attribute burn. So here we're going to create a burn attribute, just like we did with the temperature. Let's investigate the burn. So just the same thing, and we can do the same thing with the noise, but this time we're going to squish it along this axis like that. So from there, we can put down this Pyro source node, and this is also going to give us a density. So we're keeping the burn, the temperature, and the density. and then we can rasterize those attributes. So turning those points into a volume version. So you can see we're rasterizing the burn, density, temperature, and V. This is our resolution, and yeah, that's about it. From here, we're feeding that into our first source, and then we're feeding that velocity field. Oh, this is actually our, and we're feeding our collisions into the second input. So here this is set to collision and the velocity. So from here, and so this is a DOP network that's wrapped up, just like we had that source spread was a little solver wrapped up. This is our Pyro solver, which is a DOP network just made a bit more convenient for us. So if we come over here, we can see all our settings. So our resolution is set here. Our time scale is set to 2, so it's going to seem faster than normal. With Fire, often I like to increase the time scale, make it feel more chaotic, and a bit more violent. And our substeps are increased, so this is almost going to calculate 4 times every frame. Our collisions, the collision and V, that's coming from here. And our sourcing, so the density is going into the density, so this is going to generate smoke. Our temperature into the temperature, this is going to generate our like our color that we're going to use, and the flame into burns. These are going to give, again, this is like these two are quite similar, just different fields, so we've got more control over the look of our simulation and our velocity, of course. In terms of our fields, we want to add some dissipation. So this is going to dissipate, or this is kind of think of, water evaporates and smoke dissipates, and it's kind of like just how it trails off and disappears. We have some cooling on our temperature, so this is like sort of like dissipation but on temperature. And yeah, main thing we want to look at is this shape. So buoyancy is how our smoke rises, and we just have a tiny bit of buoyancy because for the most part we want our smoke just to be trailing behind this wing because it's flying throughout the air at high velocity. Disturbance, I like to think of this as detail on the surface of our smoke, and turbulence I'd like to think of as the breakup from within the smoke. So I tend to do my broader strokes with turbulence and my fine detail with disturbance. Both of these are my go-tos for any Pyro simulation. Always add disturbance and turbulence. And in terms of the look, we're visualizing this here, but for the most part we're actually going to just visualize it with this Pyro Baker node. Don't need to worry about this too much. We've got these different settings. I like to set this to BFCC. These are just different advection types. I find that this one gives you the most detail, so I often go with BFCC. Our output, we're outputting density, temperature, flame, velocity, and color. I'm not sure that we actually using the color, so you might not need to export this, but I'm not going to change anything in case I'm wrong. I don't remember seeing the color being used. So that's an extra field that we're caching. You might not want to cache this. So to optimize, let's not cache this. Compute the min-max, convert to VDB, and use 16-bit float. This is all just optimization. And we're also going to resample the velocity, because since the velocity is not something that we are going to visualize, it's just used for motion blur, we don't need its resolution to be as high as the density or the temperature, say. So in this case, we're going to cull the velocity and resample it, meaning we're going to basically multiply the resolution by 2. So, well, the voxel scale by 2, meaning its resolution is going to be halved. So if we were to investigate that, you can see our velocity is like half of what our density is, and that's just because it's been halved. If we were to remove this culling, you would see it would jump up to a similar resolution as our density. So it's something I always do, just save some disk space. And from there, we can put down a Pyro bake node, and we can visualize this. So I won't go over this too much because I think Saber is going to do the rendering and he will be using these Pyro bakes for the rendering. But for now, just to visualize, the smoke is, the density is going to the smoke, giving it a color. The fire is going in here. We're using, for the fire, we're using our flame and temperature. Scatter is not being used. Cool. So this is just being saved here. This transform is being used to move this into place with our shot. But for now, I just wanted to visualize this at the origin. So that's why I actually just came over here. But this is going to be what we're actually going to use for rendering. And here we're just removing, we don't need to worry about this. This will be covered in rendering part. Here we're deleting everything but the velocity. We can't see it, but it's going to be used in our following simulations. So that is our fire setup for the wing. Cool. One thing I forgot to show about this Pyro system is that if you dive inside the solver, just by double clicking, you can add some more micro solvers. And we want to also feed in that velocity field that we prepared. So as you can see, we're using this to, so this is coming from here, this velocity field, and we're reading this in here. So of course, this is now going to advect that our smoke, pushing it in that direction. So forgot to show that. Then we cache the disk and display. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at this spark hit. So we have some sparks here and we have some sparks down here, and really they're the same setup. Just here we've got a few more different, we've got different hits in different directions. We've got some different hits in some different places, and just like we had before, we're creating this box that encompasses our scene, and we're creating a VDB and scattering some points, and we did this before where we create some sort of like a wind tunnel that we're going to use to advect our particles. So we've got an artful field sparks, and we can read that in our pop simulation in this pop advect by volumes. So if you take a look at our last tutorial, we did particle advection by running a smoke simulation and then using the velocity from that smoke simulation to advect particles. And so in this case, we're creating this velocity on that volume, and we're just going to read it in here. So this is going to push these particles in this direction here. But let's first take a look at how they are sourced. So of course, here we have our X-wing. We're blasting everything except for this point over here. And then we can attach a Pyro burst node. You can see that this Pyro burst node takes place on frame 1260. So if we come over here, and if we press F on our keyboard, we can see where that takes place. You can see the frame duration is just 3 frames. So just for 3 frames, this sourcing is going to exist. And these just control the shape. You can play with all these things just to control the sort of look of your sourcing. And we have a second one just going in the opposite direction. So if we were to just template our X-wing, you can see one's taking place in the front, in the back, and then so there's a sort of hitch here, and you expect some sparks to fly out. So this is how this is being sourced, just using these Pyro burst nodes. Here's our collisions, and we're going to feed that into our pop simulation. Cool. So, a pop simulation, the bare minimum we need is the pop source, the pop object, and the Pyro and the pop solver. And then these nodes here, are all just going to add, some variation to our simulation. So this one is the main one, of course, the velocity field that is ejecting these particles in the backwards so they move backwards. We're just going to add some turbulence. Some more turbulence just to give some breakup, and again some more swirl size. So we got some variation. Now this node here, this is a wrangle that is just going to give us some variation on the life for the color. So if I jump back out here, what I did is I ran this with. Let's come to view it here. This is with that pop wrangle on. So if we just take a look there. You can see they get quite dark, and this is without. And it's not really a huge difference. So it's not making a gigantic difference to my eye. Just kind of like another version, really. And I would say, in terms of this color, it's a little bit darker, and that's just really we can take a look at that a bit more. This power is basically often use it to sort of fade off colors a bit more. Here we're just doing some fit range things, and we're adding some randomization. So yeah, like I said, it's not doing a lot, it's just adding, it's almost just slightly different, really. I think both could work. Here we've got this retime, and we've got this interpolate between frames. We need that for our spark trail. So if we take a look here, if we were to disable this, it's not going to work. So we need this for our spark trails, and this is basically just going to trail our particles. So this is going to just add some noise to our particles, as you can see there. This is the length, and here we can control our color based on the normalization of the age. Cool. We just cached this out to disk because we're getting some problems with the rendering. So let me just recache this, and we're gonna this is going to be transformed to place for our final shot. Like I said, right now we're just looking at this all at the origin of our scene. So this is our spark kit. Cool. So let's take a look at the sparks down here, because we actually have more sparks in our setup, and they are done slightly differently. Although the pop solver is pretty much the same, how we source these things are different. So again, bringing in our X-wing, and here we're just isolating some pieces here, and we're scattering some points on those pieces. So we're actually just scattering one point over there, and we're using a point replicate to multiply these, and we're using this QLabs. I'm using this QLabs node to give this some velocities, as you can see here. Again, you can change the direction by moving this. We're using this jitter to give some variation to the velocity and the angle. We're using this to give some cool noise. And this, again, we're also going to give this some random velocity. So if we just inspect this, let's just take a look at our velocities. So you can see our points here. So this is the overall direction. This is some jitter on the angle and the velocity. This is some curl noise. not doing a great deal. And another noise type. Cool. We feed that into our little pop solver system. And it's the same thing that we had before. This time with a little bit of air resistance. We've got that life and then just some turbulent noise on these. Cool. Here's our collisions you can see here, being written here. And that's coming from here. We run our sim and you can see we've got these points flying around. Time shift with this enabled, and we can trail our sparks. Cool. And over here we were doing something again slightly more differently. This time, instead of using that Pyro burst node, we can essentially do the same thing by taking a sphere. So here we're isolating a piece of our geometry. We're going to scatter one point on here, and we're going to copy that sphere, distorted sphere, to that point. So now it sits on our vehicle. As we template this here. So from here we can compute the velocity of this, because this noise is being animated. You can see the scale here. It's a 5 here, but over here starts at 0. So this can now be used to calculate our velocity. So on this node, we're actually not really changing the velocity's direction too much. We're just multiplying the velocity down. And it's also great that we can now visualize it. Here we're going to add some jitter. Doesn't actually look like this is doing anything. Oh no, we are. Cool. Here again, we're using this jitter, so we just, you can see we're jittering the velocity and the angle. And into our pop network. So with this cached disk, you can see our points. Another thing I wanted to mention is that you can see that our sparks sort of shoot out here. And then the wind sort of takes over and they get all pushed towards the back. And that is coming from on our pop wind. If we come over, so you can see here the activation is 0, and then after the simulation starts, after 4 frames, it turns on, and that's going to result in our particles just flying backwards. So with this cached disk, you can see our points. If we come over here to our X-wing explosion and X-wing small explosions, you can see that we've basically doing the same thing that we did for our sparks, where we've got these pyro burst nodes. Except over here you can see we're creating a density, a temperature, a burn, a color, and an alpha. So we've got that on all of our pyro bursts. We're merging them all together, so you can see we've got something like this. Cool. From there, we're going to rasterize all these attributes. So we've got them as volumes, because as you know, in order to do a pyro simulation, we can't use points. we need to use volumes as our source. So these are now rasterized into volumes, as you can see here. Our collisions for our ship are here, and we're going to feed this into our Pyro solver. And just like before, here we have our resolution, our bounds, our collisions. We're sourcing the density, this trail density. I don't see that, so I think, yeah. So this we can just uncheck. We've got temperature, burn, and velocity. And then here, I'm just going to run this as a test. Cache this to disk. If we dive inside, we can take a look. We have some gas turbulence, and we've got this gas disturb. So just some more microsolvers. On our settings, we have some dissipation, and under shape, some buoyancy, disturbance, turbulence, and shredding. Our smoke has an orangey tint, and we have a fire, but of course, you know, we're going to visualize this a little bit better with a pyrobake node down the line. So once we cache that out to disk, I'm just going to disable this for now. We can see here is our explosion. So here we can see we've got our final explosion. Cool. If we come over here, we can see that we've just got, you know, we're taking these points that we used for our explosion, and we're just creating a pyro burst here. Let's just go back to, let's see the start frame, 134. I mean, 1,345. So we can see we've got some sparks. We can see we've got a pyro burst here. We've got a pyro burst here. We're running our pop simulation, we're trailing those, we're merging them together, and we're caching them out to disk again. So now we have something like this. And of course, once that layers up with everything, we're just going to have, you know, an explosion and our, so let's just have a quick look. Let's merge this. Merge this together, and now we can see we've got an explosion with our sparks all happening together. Cool.
Next up, let's take a pass at this RBD section. And as you can see here, we've got our jets, and we've just got some simple destruction. But once this all gets layered together, it's going to look pretty impressive. So starting off, we of course going to just bring in our fighter. We transforming this into the origin of our scene, and here we're using this delete small pieces, and we're just using it to create a group and an attribute called class, and then we can split. So we're using this split to split the small pieces out on this side, and the larger pieces are out on this side. And I think this class 1145, I think that is this piece over here. This so this piece here is like the end of the wing. Yeah, let's take a look at this here next. So we've got a poly doctor, which is just going to fix some of our polygons. Like if you have issues with your geometry, sometimes you can, you know, go look at a polydoctor to clean things up a bit. So we're just repairing our geometry. From there, we're going to create a name attribute, and this is going to give us a name. So let's take a look here. And we, like I said, we also got that class attribute that's being created here. So let's just take a look by putting down a color. And let's say random from attribute. And we need to look at the primitives, class, random from attribute. Cool. So now we've got all our pieces and they have this class attribute. On our assemble node, we need all our pieces to have a name attribute. That's just something that we have to always do when doing destruction. And if we take a look at our name attribute, you can see that it's, you know, a very similar thing to that we did up here. Perhaps some repetition. But I think we were just doing that so we could isolate this piece of the geometry. So if you take a look here, we've got all these small pieces and we've got that one piece there. Here we've got this connectivity node so that we can isolate just this wing, and then coming over here we can just, double click and then blast. So here we've got the wing. We're creating a VDB version, scattering some points, and then replicating those points. So this is going to give, so we can use these points to now fracture our geometry, and it's almost going to look like this is where some bullets have hit or lasers have hit, and that's going to fracture our geometry here with this RBD material fracture. And as you can see, if we take a look here, let's expand this a bit. We can see we've got more pieces here. It's not super obvious. So maybe what we could do is we could replicate this even more. I'm just going to click save quick. So as you can see, the more points we get, the more fractures we're going to get. And as you can see, it looks like these have now been hit by bullet hits. If we put down a color node, we maybe visualize this a bit better. Let's say random from attribute again. We want to look at the primitives and name. So you can see we've got all these little points, and those are coming from that point replicate here. And they are internal actually, because we are scattering them inside this density. We've got this density, and as you can see, these are not on the surface, this is internal. And so now you can see better. Cool. On the other side, time shifting this. So we've got everything on a static frame. We're assembling each one of these pieces, creating a name attribute. So if we were to take this color node and we take a look at the name here, you can see these each one of these things are little pieces. If we were to put down an exploded view, we can take a look at what we've got here. And I don't think we're doing any fracturing here, are we? Yeah, we're just fracturing this piece over here. So this piece is getting fractured by this node here. As you can see, we're looping over that class, so this is our piece over here, and we're just breaking this up a few times. And this node is going to give us three things. It's going to give us our geometry, our constraints, and our proxy geometry. So if we put down a null, we can take a look at that. So here's our geometry. Here's our constraints. As you can see, it's just a constraint along here. And our proxy geo, which is not really going to be any different from our high-res geometry, because we're not really dealing with high-res geometry in this case. But this node is going to give us three outputs, and this is quite convenient because our little RBD system at top level that Houdini's created for us all takes in these 3 inputs. But what happens if you want to merge some geometry, like this geometry, with this geometry? Well, then we've got a problem, because we can't just merge it, you know, like, because we've got 3 inputs. So what Houdini's given us is this RBD pack. And so we can pack all of this data, and we can pack all of this data here, and then we can simply merge all of that data together. And then when we want to feed this back into our next node, we can just simply RBD unpack. And then that once again is going to give us our geometry, our constraints, and our proxy geometry. So if we were to, let's just take a look at this again. So we're going to take a look at, for instance, our constraints here. So this is a bit weird. We've got a point here, but you know, this still works. So this is our constraints for this side, and this is our constraints from this side. So it's just this, and we want to merge these constraints. So we pack, we put that all together. And if we were to take a look at this constraints here now, you'll see we have this constraint mixed with this one, and that goes for our geometry and our proxy geometry too. So that's the purpose of these nodes. Here we just caching everything to disk. If we were to come here, and if we were to come over here, this is where we've got some rules for our constraints. So we're just giving this a glue constraint, and it's got a strength of 1. And we're not really going to do anything crazy, because what we're actually going to do is make sure that all of these points are inactive. And then we've got this group that's going to run along and make these points active. So you can see here, everything is inactive. Then this is going to become active, and then that. So this will fall apart, and then we'll have another a rule that's just going to make all of this active, and we're just going to animate that on. So if we were to take a look at that, it's coming from here, and you can see we've got 2 rules set up here. So this one is based on this group, and you can see that it's just running over the group, setting the active or inactive. And this is for our overall geometry, and you can see here that everything is set to inactive, with the exclusion of that group, of course. And then once it reaches this point, this switches over to active, and that's when our explosion takes place. And we're going to use the velocity from that explosion to push all our pieces out. So in order to take a look at that, we're going to dive inside here, and you can see we've got this pop effect, and this is reading in our velocity from our explosion. And so a similar thing here, we also just have like that sort of wind velocity. And yeah, we've got a similar version, which I'll show you now. So if we just dive back outside, and I think it's coming from here. So here's our explosion cached. Then we're blasting everything but the velocity, and we've got this null out here so that we can read in. So as the explosion takes place, the velocity from that's going to push all our pieces out. And then over here, we also have that system that we've used a few times, you know, creating this sort of velocities here. And that's also going to push our pieces in the backwards direction. Just some pop wind with some turbulence, you know, to give us some more sort of swirly motion. And this is some angular velocity, so that our pieces have some angular velocity. We're going to cache this to disk, and as you can see here are all our points, because we're just going to cache out from here, cache the points, because what we like to do is keep everything light, and what we can just use this transform pieces using the cached points and our geometry. And with that, we can then basically transform those pieces apart. So as you can see, these pieces here are now becoming active. They fly away, and then at this point here, all our pieces become active. The explosion takes place. It pushes these pieces outwards and then backwards. We just got to retime with interpolate between frames. I always do that after an RBD sim. This transform is obviously transforming this along with our animation. So when we look through our shot camera, everything is the correct place. And we have a VDB version for any collisions that we may need. And I think we already took a look at this being read into. Actually, I don't think we're actually using this. Yeah, we're not using this, but if you were to use this, you could use this for trails. I'll leave that up to you guys. Cool, that's pretty much everything. The only other thing we need to cover is just some set dressing. So like we have some sky, so we've got a box. We're creating some noise, some more noise, converting this into clouds with this cloud node. More cloud noise. Again, more cloud noise. Here we're lowering our density quite a bit. Save that out to disk and apply a material, and this could be our clouds. Here we have a fog volume. Diving inside, we're just using this position to add some noise. A ramp so we can control this, fit range, and out density. So as you can see here, we can control where we have our density. So this is going to control the back part. You get the idea. Here we have a windy version. So we're using our camera. We're pulling in our camera. This is with a QLabs tool. Setting a bound. Time shifting this so that we just have one frame. Transforming this up. Converting this into VDB. Adding some noise. Lowering the density, and this is animated. So if we take a look here, you can see we've got some animation on this offset, and that's going to give us this animation here. Here we have an L system. So coming over to this lightning section, we can take a look at how we use L system to generate our lightning. And if coming over here, we can take a look at our L system. So what an L system is a recursive set of rules that are just going to generate some basic geometry for us. So let me here we can take a look at our rules, and you can find these algorithms online. And we're actually doing quite a bit here. So I'm just going to bring this down. This is essentially our basic L system. So basically we're going forward, and then we're branching off, and we're creating this recursive tree-like structure. And coming over to the values here, we can then start distorting things and shaping our lightning. You can play with these values, our overall size, and you can sort of art direct your lightning strike. And I believe this is animating on. And that's coming from this generations. As you can see here. So that is our L system. Coming over here, we're going to set this attribute called PF, which is going to be used for our P scale, and we've got a ramp on here. So we need to take a look at this at the end here. So you can see here we're controlling this P scale. We're going to use this node to generate a distance for ourselves. So if we come over to this color node, I think I'll put it in here. We can take a look at this distance. And if we were to come over to our geometry spreadsheet, we can see our distance is going from this value all the way down to 0. And we want to normalize that. So we can, first of all, we're going to resample. So we've got this distance, resampling it. We're clicking on curve view so we can generate this attribute, this one. So each line is going to have a curve view and a class that's going to make sure that each piece has its own attributes. And here we're remapping that distance. So this is going to normalize that distance between that value and it's going to remap it to 0 to 1. So now we can take this distance and take a look at it remapped between 0 and 1. And now we have this nice gradient. And we can use this gradient, for instance, to add noise, and we can use this as a multiplier. So we can have more noise on the top and less noise at the bottom. And we're doing exactly that over here. So as you can see, there's a lot of noise towards the ends and less so here, and that is based on the distance. This is an overall noise. Use it, don't use it. Just more control. And we're also using the distance and this P and this amp F and this attribute that we created at the beginning, plus a multiplier so that we always have some p-scale values. Again, more manipulation of the p-scale. So we're just layering these up to get more control. So on this node, we want to isolate this main thick branch. Well, we're going to make it thick using this node, but we're grabbing our first main branch, which is, the primitive 0, and it's based on the ID, and we're going to be multiplying the p-scale up by 5. So if we were to dive inside here, you can see here's that we're setting our p-scale. This is our multiplier, and we're exporting this. And as you can see here, we are running this over the first primitive. If we were to change this to 1, it'll be the second, third. You get the idea, but we want our initial branch, which is branch 0. And that way we can multiply this up. We increase this. This is just a multiplier for our p-scale. From there, we obviously polywire this, which we've been visualizing, because without this, it's still just lines, it's just data. But now we can visualize this by reading this in with our p-scale. Here we can create a normal and then just set some color. So we're using the position and we're just offsetting that a bit based on our class. And it's just a ramp from dark blue to light blue. And save that out to disk. Cool. The last thing we need to cover is our laser bolts. And if we come over here, the last thing we need to do is cover these bolts. And if we come over here, we can see we've got our X-wing. We're going to peak this. We're just going to blast a few pieces, scatter some points, and create a particle ID on these points. So you can see, so our points here have particle IDs, and what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 points here. So one here and one here, and we're going to connect them with our points that we've just scattered across here. So if I were to just take a look at this, you can see these are our scattered points. This is our first point, this is our second point, and we're just going to loop over each one of them and we're going to connect this line. So if we come over to the end here, you can see all of these points are now connected to these 2 locations. And we also have a group, and we're going to group this one, and that way we can split between the ones connected to this point and the points connected there. And we're doing exactly that with the split. So on this side, we've got those points, and on this side, we've got those points. Merge those all back together. And by using a polyframe, we can compute the tangent, and we can, instead of using the tangent, we're going to put a V in there. That way, all of these points now have velocity. So if I were to just come in middle mouse button this, click this, you can see we have our velocities traveling in this direction. So from here, we can group these 2 points based on, this bounding sphere. So we're just grouping these two. And of course, these have our velocities, and we're just going to multiply that velocity up by 25. Here we have a switch, so we're just going to enable this. So the lasers are only going to start firing after 1,310. So 1,310. This is when this becomes active. Cool. So they're now active, and we're going to feed this into a very simple pop sim, and that's just going to shoot particles in the direction of our scattered points. So nothing special. This is about as simple as it can get. We've got our source group is our emit group, and we're just constantly shooting 5 points. So as you can see here, I'm just going to turn off our velocities. Well, not turn it off, but turn off the visualization. And you can see we have those points traveling. Actually, they fire, and then I think they stop after. I had this the other way around in my head. So cool. And then it stops. Here we're just deleting all our attributes that, except for the ID, the particle ID, and the velocity. We can then trail these. As you can see now, let's zoom in a bit. So now we have 2, and if we just add those, we can create a little line. Resample that line, compute the curve view so that we now have an attribute traveling along. So if I take a look at the color, and we just take a look at the curve view, I say ramp along attribute, make this blue, make this red, and inspect the curve view. You can see we've got this attribute traveling along, and we can use that in our p-scale here. So the width is here, and we're promoting the curve view to width. And here we're using this to control that width. And of course, that's now just going in here. Setting a color, and then saving to disk. Cool.